Just a few charred scraps of paper in a midnight fireplace directly triggered the most ruthless legal purge in Tudor history. To conceal the records of the Queen's past physical encounters, Dowager Duchess Agnes Tilney manually destroyed all documents relating to her granddaughter. The Crown immediately classified this interference with physical evidence as treason, transforming the Howard dynasty's seemingly limitless dynastic wealth into confiscated state property. Royal guards stormed in to physically strip the nation's most powerful matriarch of her jewelry, throwing a woman in her 60s into a stone dungeon. Is there any downfall more devastating than a dynasty of unparalleled wealth being completely dismantled by the state simply because a handful of ashes could not cover up the clandestine past of a queen? Late 15th century England was a realm defined by endemic instability. For decades, the Wars of the Roses, a bloody dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York, had ravaged the country, decimating the ancient nobility. When the dust finally settled in 1485, King Henry VII claimed victory at Bosworth Field. The Tudor dynasty was born, and the English political landscape was fundamentally transformed. Henry VII was a usurper who had won his crown by right of conquest. He was deeply, inherently suspicious of independent aristocratic power. He understood that overmighty subjects with vast estates and private armies could easily plunge the country back into civil war. Therefore, the early Tudor era was defined by the Crown's aggressive efforts to financially and legally neuter the great lords of the realm. It was into this tense transitional era that Agnes Tilney was born, around the year 1477. She did not belong to the high aristocracy. She was born into the upper echelons of the gentry class, the daughter of Hugh Tilney of Skirbeck in Boston, located in the prosperous agricultural county of Lincolnshire. Her family was wealthy, heavily involved in local administration, and possessed substantial estates. The gentry were the backbone of English local government, but they lacked the grand hereditary titles, the massive retinues, and, crucially, the immediate lethal peril associated with the high nobility. Agnes grew up in a world where land meant security and local influence, but she was acutely aware that proximity to the throne, the ultimate source of patronage, was a double-edged sword. To be near the king was to be near the executioner's axe. While the Tilney family enjoyed relative stability in Lincolnshire, the family that Agnes would eventually marry into was fighting for its very survival. The Howards were a family of immense antiquity and ambition, but they had made a catastrophic political miscalculation. They had fought on the wrong side at the Battle of Bosworth. John Howard, the first Duke of Norfolk, had remained fiercely loyal to King Richard III, commanding the vanguard of the Yorkist army. He was killed in the brutal melee of the battle. His son Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey, fought alongside his father. He survived the battle, but he was immediately captured by Henry VII's victorious forces. The punishment for the Howards was absolute. Thomas Howard was stripped of his titles. He was hit with an act of attainder, which confiscated his family's massive estates, their wealth, and legally corrupted their bloodline, declaring them traitors. Thomas was imprisoned in the damp confines of the Tower of London, where he spent 3 years reflecting on the cost of failed loyalty. When he was finally released, Thomas Howard spent the first decade of the Tudor reign desperately trying to prove his utility to Henry VII. he was tasked with putting down rebellions in the north, working tirelessly to claw back pieces of his family's confiscated estates and restore their honor. It was a time when political rehabilitation required flawless military service, highly strategic marriages, and absolute unquestioning loyalty to the Tudor crown. This was the environment that shaped the Howard family ethos, and it was the environment that would soon shape Agnes Tilney's understanding of power. She learned early on that power in Tudor England was hard-won, incredibly fragile, easily lost to the whims of a monarch, and required ruthless, unsentimental management to maintain. In August 1497, Agnes Tilney's life trajectory shifted permanently when she married Thomas Howard, who was still serving as the Earl of Surrey. This union was not a sweeping romantic love match celebrated by poets. It was a cold, pragmatic, and highly strategic political maneuver. Agnes was the cousin of Thomas's recently deceased first wife, Elizabeth Tilney. By marrying Agnes, Thomas Howard achieved a crucial financial objective. He kept her considerable inheritance and her substantial dowry locked firmly within his immediate family circle, preventing that wealth from passing to a rival family. The dynamics of the marriage were stark. He was a middle-aged veteran, a man hardened by imprisonment and warfare, actively fighting a relentless political campaign to reclaim his father's dukedom. She was a young woman of the gentry, approximately 20 years his junior, stepping into a politically volatile household that was constantly under the scrutiny of the Tudor king. For the first 15 years of their marriage, Agnes proved her competence. While Thomas fought the king's wars in Scotland and on the continent, Agnes remained at home. She effectively managed the vast Howard estates, oversaw the collection of rents, handled local disputes, and raised a large family. She demonstrated that she possessed the administrative acumen required of an aristocratic wife. The turning point for the Howard family, and the event that catapulted Agnes into the highest stratosphere of English society, came in September 1513 at the muddy, blood-soaked Battle of Flodden. King Henry VIII, young and hungry for glory, was campaigning in France. Seizing the opportunity of an absent English king, King James IV of Scotland launched a massive invasion across the northern border into England. Thomas Howard, now an elderly man in his 70s, was tasked with defending the realm. He marched an English army north and met the Scots at Flodden Field in Northumberland. Despite being outnumbered and facing modern Scottish artillery, Thomas Howard utilized brilliant tactical maneuvers and the devastating effectiveness of the English longbow and billhook to secure a crushing, historically decisive victory on the battlefield. The Scottish army was annihilated. King James IV himself was killed in the thick of the fighting, his body later recovered by Howard's men. It was one of the most decisive military victories in English history. The reward for this monumental military triumph was the restoration of the Howard family's ultimate prize. In 1514, a grateful King Henry VIII formally restored the title of Duke of Norfolk to Thomas Howard. Overnight, the political reality of the Howard family was transformed, and with it, the status of Agnes Tilney changed forever. She was no longer the Countess of Surrey, she became the Duchess of Norfolk. This was not a mere change in nomenclature. It was a profound elevation in social hierarchy. She was now the premier peeress of the realm. Outside of the women born directly into the immediate royal family, no woman in England outranked Agnes Tilney. She commanded massive respect. She controlled immense wealth, and she had direct, intimate access to the centers of Tudor power. She had arrived at the pinnacle of aristocratic society, but she was about to discover that standing at the top of the mountain only makes you a clearer target for the storm. By the early 1520s, Agnes Tilney had reached the zenith of English aristocratic society. As the Duchess of Norfolk, she was an indispensable fixture at the Tudor court. She had attended the Field of the Cloth of Gold, served as a godmother to royal princesses, and firmly established the Howard family as the premier conservative power in the realm. However, the dynamics of her power were about to undergo a profound shift. In May 1524, Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, died at the advanced age of 81. The vast Howard Empire now passed to Agnes's stepson, Thomas Howard, who became the third Duke of Norfolk. In Tudor society, widowhood for an aristocratic woman could mean a quiet retreat to a rural nunnery or fading into irrelevance in the shadow of the new heir. Agnes Tilney chose an entirely different path. She transitioned into a new, incredibly powerful, and highly autonomous role, the Dowager Duchess. Through a series of meticulously negotiated property agreements and her own substantial jointure, the lands and income legally guaranteed to a widow, Agnes retained independent control over vast estates. She was financially untouchable, boasting an annual income that rivaled many of the great lords of the realm. To exercise this power, she maintained two primary palatial residences, Chesworth House in Sussex, and her magnificent London base, a sprawling estate located across the River Thames from Westminster, heavily associated with the nearby Lambeth Palace. As a wealthy, independent widow, Agnes established what was effectively a secondary court. She was no longer just the wife of the Duke. She was a sovereign matriarch within her own domain. Her household was massive, requiring hundreds of servants, stewards, guards, and administrative officials to maintain her opulent standard of living. And because of her unparalleled rank and deep connections at the royal court, her household became a premier destination for the youth of the English elite. The fatal environment that Agnes Tilney cultivated was a direct and inevitable byproduct of the strict Tudor tradition regarding aristocratic wardship and placement. In the 16th century, the nobility rarely raised their children entirely at home. It was customary to send young boys and girls to live in the households of superior lords and ladies. This system served a dual purpose. It was both an educational academy and a political networking hub. Young men learned estate administration, military skills, and courtly etiquette. Young women learned household management, music, and deportment, and crucially, they were placed in an environment where they could be noticed and secure highly advantageous marriages. To have a daughter placed in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk was a massive social coup. It was assumed that Agnes Tilney ran a tight, pious, and highly disciplined ship. It was into this vast, bustling household that a young, impoverished relative arrived in the 1530s. Her name was Catherine Howard. She was the daughter of Agnes's stepson, Lord Edmund Howard, a man perpetually drowning in debt. Unable to care for her, Edmund sent Catherine to live with her step-grandmother. Catherine was a poor relation, relying entirely on the charity and the formidable reputation of the Dowager Duchess to secure her future. From the outside, Lambeth Palace and Chesworth House appeared to be bastions of conservative Tudor morality. The Dowager Duchess was known for her strict, often harsh demeanor, but historical records heavily sourced from the terrifying treason interrogations that would occur years later reveal a massive, catastrophic administrative failure. Agnes Tilney suffered from a fatal blind spot. She was deeply engaged in the macro-management of her estates, the high-stakes factional politics of her stepson, the third Duke, and her own position at the royal court. But she profoundly neglected the micromanagement of the teenagers living under her own roof. She ran a household of hundreds, but as she aged, she increasingly isolated herself in her private, luxurious chambers. She delegated the daily practical supervision of the young aristocratic girls to junior female attendants and gentlewomen. These attendants were utterly ill-equipped to control a dormitory full of hormonal, aristocratic teenagers. They possessed no real authority, and more dangerously, they were easily bribed or intimidated. Discipline did not just slip under Agnes Tilney's watch. It completely and utterly collapsed. The epicenter of this collapse was the Maiden's Chamber, the large communal dormitory where the young gentlewomen of the household, including Catherine Howard, slept. In a properly run Tudor household, the Maiden's Chamber would be locked from the outside at night, with the key held by a trusted senior matron. But at Lambeth Palace, the security protocols were a joke. The girls easily stole the keys, made copies, or simply bribed the attendants to look the other way. This lack of supervision created a highly porous environment where unauthorized men, musicians, minor retainers, and gentlemen pensioners had free illicit access to the young women in Agnes's care long after the Dowager Duchess had gone to sleep. The first major breach of protocol involved a household music teacher named Henry Mannix. Mannix took advantage of the lax supervision to engage in highly inappropriate, intimate physical contact with the young Catherine Howard. Eventually, Agnes Tilney discovered the transgression. Her reaction was physical and swift. She slapped both Catherine and Mannix, and she banished the music teacher from the girls' immediate quarters. However, Agnes's response was entirely superficial. She punished the individuals, but she completely failed to recognize the systemic vulnerability of her household. She did not change the locks, she did not replace the corrupt attendants, and she did not increase her own supervision. She simply returned to her private chambers, believing the matter was settled. She had left the door wide open for a far more dangerous predator. The situation in the Maiden's Chamber escalated from inappropriate touching to a legally binding disaster with the arrival of Francis Derham. Derham was a gentleman pensioner, a minor courtier who served the Howard family in various capacities. He was older than Catherine, possessed a bold, aggressive swagger, and had a degree of independent wealth. When Derham assessed the security of the Dowager Duchess's household, he realized he could do whatever he wanted. Derham systematically bribed the attendants and the other girls in the dormitory. He didn't just sneak into the Maiden's Chamber. He hosted elaborate, secret, late-night banquets. He brought in expensive wine, strawberries, and baked meats, effectively buying the silence and the enthusiastic complicity of the entire room. The girls acted as lookouts, turning a blind eye while Derham and Catherine Howard engaged in a highly visible, intimate relationship. This was not a minor, fleeting scandal of youth. The relationship between Francis Derham and Catherine Howard crossed a profound legal threshold. They did not hide their devotion from the rest of the girls in the dormitory. They openly exchanged expensive gifts. He bought her fine silks and velvet. She gave him a decorative band. Most dangerously, they openly referred to each other as husband and wife in front of multiple witnesses. In 16th century Tudor England, marriage laws were complex and often rested on verbal agreements rather than church paperwork. If a man and a woman freely exchanged vows of commitment in the present tense, verba de presenti, declaring their intention to be married and subsequently consummated that relationship, it held the exact same legal weight as a formal church wedding. In the strict language of canon law, this was known as a pre-contract. The legal seal was set when Derham prepared to leave for a venture in Ireland. Before departing, he entrusted Catherine with his entire life savings, a massive sum of £100, telling her that if he did not return, the money was hers. In Tudor society, transferring the administration of one's wealth to a woman in this trusting manner was the absolute hallmark of a legally recognized marriage. Catherine Howard and Francis Derham were legally speaking bound to each other. She was his wife. Eventually, rumors of Derham's behavior reached the Dowager Duchess. Once again, Agnes Tilney reacted with aristocratic fury rather than calculated political sense. She beat Catherine, forced Derham out of her household, and likely believed she had successfully stamped out a localized fire. But Agnes made a fatal decision. She decided to handle the matter entirely internally. She did not report the pre-contract to the ecclesiastical courts to have it formally dissolved. She did not inform her stepson, the powerful Duke of Norfolk, that his niece was now legally compromised. She prioritized avoiding public embarrassment over her legal and moral duty. She chose to cover it up. Agnes's internal justification was entirely shaped by the immense, unrelenting social pressure placed upon a high-ranking aristocratic matriarch. She was responsible for the reputations of dozens of girls. If word leaked to the royal court that Lambeth Palace was an unsupervised den of illicit affairs, the marriage prospects for every single ward in her care would be utterly destroyed. The Howard family's carefully cultivated reputation as reliable, pious conservatives would be shattered. Furthermore, admitting to the pre-contract meant admitting that she, the great Dowager Duchess, had completely and utterly failed in her primary duty of guardianship. Her pride would not allow it. She swept Francis Derham under the rug, assuming that a minor gentleman pensioner could simply be erased from history by the sheer force of her aristocratic will. She had no idea that within a few short years, the volatile politics of the Tudor court would drag the girl from the maiden's chamber out of obscurity, place a royal crown on her head, and turn Agnes Tilney's silent cover-up into an act of high treason against the most dangerous king in Europe. Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, had successfully swept the scandalous pre-contract between her step-granddaughter Catherine Howard and the gentleman pensioner Francis Derham under the rug of Lambeth Palace. By banishing the pensioner and beating the teenager, Agnes believed she had extinguished a minor domestic fire. She fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the Tudor political machine. In the late 1530s, the English court was a ruthless ecosystem where young aristocratic women were not treated as individuals. They were treated as highly valuable currency, deployed by ambitious families to purchase the ultimate commodity, the king's favor. And the Howard family was about to place Catherine on the deadliest gaming table in Europe. The precise reason a compromised teenager was suddenly thrust into the royal spotlight is rooted deeply within the geopolitical and domestic crisis of 1539 and 1540. King Henry VIII was entering his late 40s. He was a widower, still mourning the death of his third wife, Jane Seymour, who had finally provided him with a legitimate male heir, Prince Edward. However, England was entirely isolated on the world stage. The Pope had excommunicated Henry, and the two great Catholic superpowers of Europe, France and the Holy Roman Empire, had signed a truce, raising the terrifying prospect of a joint Catholic crusade against Protestant England. Henry's chief minister, the pragmatic and brutally efficient Thomas Cromwell, orchestrated a diplomatic solution. He arranged a marriage between King Henry and a German princess, Anne of Cleves, to secure an alliance with the Protestant Schmalkaldic League. It was a brilliant political maneuver, but an absolute personal disaster. When Henry finally met Anne of Cleves in early 1540, he was physically repulsed. He famously complained to his courtiers, stating, "I like her not," and finding her lacking in the refined courtly graces he expected. He went through with the marriage ceremony to avoid a catastrophic diplomatic insult to his new German allies, but the marriage was never consummated. Henry VIII was miserable. He was an aging, ailing monarch trapped in a loveless political marriage, and his frustration was boiling over. The conservative Catholic faction at court, led by Agnes Tilney's stepson, Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, and Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, saw the king's misery as the opportunity of a lifetime. They absolutely despised Thomas Cromwell. They hated his low birth, his radical religious reforms that were stripping the altars of England, and his unprecedented control over the king. They knew that if they could exploit Henry's dissatisfaction with Anne of Cleves, they could finally destroy Cromwell and restore the ancient nobility, specifically the Howards, to absolute power. But they needed a weapon. They needed a distraction so captivating that Henry would willingly tear up his foreign policy and discard his most effective minister. The Duke of Norfolk looked to his extended family network. He bypassed the older, more experienced women of the Howard clan and selected the vivacious, highly energetic, and seemingly innocent teenager languishing in the Dowager Duchess's household, Catherine Howard. In the spring of 1540, Catherine Howard was brought from Lambeth Palace and appointed as a maid of honor to the new queen, Anne of Cleves. It is here that the debate surrounding Agnes Tilney's culpability reaches its zenith. When the Duke of Norfolk selected Catherine to be placed directly in the king's path, Agnes Tilney actively participated in her promotion. She did not raise her hand and stop the process. She did not pull the Duke aside and inform him that Catherine was damaged goods, legally bound by a pre-contract to Francis Derham. Instead, Agnes helped furnish Catherine with the appropriate, highly expensive wardrobe required for court. She offered guidance on etiquette, essentially packaging Catherine as the flawless image of a pure, obedient Tudor maiden. Why did Agnes stay silent? Proponents of the malicious conspiracy theory argue that Agnes willfully ignored the legal reality of the pre-contract, because the lure of putting another Howard girl on the throne, after the spectacular rise and fall of her other step-granddaughter, Anne Boleyn, was simply too intoxicating. They believed the king was easily manipulated by youth, and that the sheer intimidating power of the Howard family could crush any rumors of Catherine's past if they ever surfaced. However, a more nuanced view suggests that Agnes was trapped by her own previous cover-up. Having failed to report the incident when it happened, admitting it now would mean confessing to the formidable Duke of Norfolk that she had allowed his niece to be ruined under her own roof. Furthermore, in the aristocratic mindset of the era, Agnes may have genuinely convinced herself that a physical, verbal vow made by a teenager to a minor servant was simply beneath the notice of the law, a triviality that could be forgotten. Whatever her internal justification, her silence was a staggering, catastrophic political gamble with irreversible consequences. The Howard faction's plan worked with terrifying, flawless precision. When King Henry VIII laid eyes on Catherine Howard, he was entirely captivated. Catherine was the exact opposite of Anne of Cleves. She was petite, exceptionally graceful, dressed in the latest French fashions, and possessed a flirtatious energy that made the aging, chronically pained monarch feel young, vital, and masculine again. Henry's infatuation quickly escalated into a complete obsession. The conservative faction carefully managed their interactions, hosting banquets at the Bishop of Winchester's palace where the king could dine privately with the teenager. Henry showered her with grants of land, heavy gold chains, and exquisite jewels. He genuinely believed he had found a pure, innocent maiden, a sanctuary of untainted love after decades of marital bitterness. He famously began calling her his rose without a thorn. Driven by his desperate desire to possess Catherine, Henry ordered Thomas Cromwell to find a legal mechanism to annul the unconsummated marriage to Anne of Cleves. Anne wisely agreed to the annulment without a fight, accepting a generous settlement. But Cromwell was not spared. The Duke of Norfolk used the disaster of the Cleves marriage to convince the king that Cromwell was a secret heretic plotting against the crown. On June 10, 1540, the Duke of Norfolk personally arrested Cromwell at the Privy Council table. On July 28, 1540, the bloodiest and most triumphant day in the history of the Howard family occurred simultaneously. On Tower Hill, Thomas Cromwell was systematically beheaded by a notoriously unskillful executioner. Just a few miles away, King Henry VIII privately married the teenage Catherine Howard. Catherine was now the Queen Consort of England. Agnes Tilney's step-granddaughter sat on the throne. The Howards had achieved absolute, unchallenged political dominance. But they had built their victory on a legal landmine. The deception held for over a year. During that time, Agnes Tilney enjoyed the prestige of being the grandmother to the Queen. But the claustrophobic world of the Tudor court is unforgiving to those with secrets. In 1541, the ghost of Lambeth Palace returned to haunt them. Francis Derham, the gentleman pensioner who held Catherine's pre-contract and her life savings, returned from a venture in Ireland. Upon discovering that his secret betrothed was now the Queen of England, Derham did not flee. Blinded by arrogance and a lethal sense of entitlement, he walked directly into the royal court and leveraged his past to secure a highly lucrative position. Terrified of exposure, Queen Catherine capitulated to his blackmail. She appointed Francis Derham as her private secretary and gentleman usher. Agnes Tilney was undoubtedly aware that Derham had been brought into the Queen's inner circle. She must have felt the cold grip of panic. The man she had violently banished from Lambeth Palace was now swaggering through the corridors of royal power, boasting to other courtiers about his deep privileged connection to the Queen. He was a ticking time bomb, and Agnes could do nothing but watch in paralyzed silence as the fuse burned down. To make matters worse, the immense stress of her position drove the young Queen to initiate a highly reckless, secret affair with Thomas Culpeper, a favored gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. The Queen's household had become a toxic web of extortion, jealousy, and high treason. The absolute dominance of the Howard family at court was a constant source of frustration for the reformist faction, led by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer was desperate for any political leverage to break the conservative grip on the king, and in the autumn of 1541, the weapon he needed was handed directly to him. John Lascelles, a firm Protestant, approached Cranmer with an explosive piece of intelligence. John's sister, Mary Lascelles, had been a ward at Lambeth Palace. She had shared the maiden's chamber with Catherine Howard. When John suggested to his sister that she should seek a position in the new Queen's household, Mary refused, citing Catherine's light behavior and explicitly detailing the entire hidden history of the late-night banquets and the physical relationship with Francis Derham. Archbishop Cranmer immediately recognized the fatal and deeply treasonous nature of this information. If Catherine and Derham held a valid pre-contract, then the king's marriage was technically void from the beginning. It was an act of profound treasonous deception against the crown. On November 2nd, 1541, the Feast of All Souls, Cranmer approached the king in the royal chapel at Hampton Court Palace. He quietly handed Henry a sealed letter detailing the allegations regarding the maiden's chamber at Lambeth Palace, and swiftly retreated. King Henry VIII read the letter. Initially, he flatly refused to believe it, convinced it was a malicious forgery. But as a matter of state security, he authorized a secret, immediate investigation. The king's investigators moved with terrifying speed. Within hours, they located Mary Lascelles and several other former wards of the Dowager Duchess. Under intense interrogation, the women corroborated every detail. They confirmed the stolen keys, the intimacy, and the pre-contract. Francis Derham was immediately arrested under a false pretext and thrown into the dungeons of the Tower of London. When the news of Derham's sudden arrest reached Agnes Tilney at Lambeth Palace, the illusion of her invulnerability shattered. The king's men were closing in, and she realized with absolute horror that the physical evidence of her treasonous negligence was sitting right inside her own home. The sudden, secretive arrest of Francis Derham in the autumn of 1541 sent shock waves through the Tudor court, but nowhere was the terror felt more acutely than in the opulent halls of Lambeth Palace. Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, understood the brutal mechanics of Henry VIII's justice system better than almost anyone alive. She knew that when the king's interrogators took a man to the Tower of London, they rarely left without extracting the truth, no matter how much physical force was required. The illusion of Howard invincibility had evaporated. The king's men were closing in, and Agnes realized with absolute heart-stopping horror that the physical evidence of her treasonous negligence was sitting right inside her own home. When Francis Derham had been aggressively banished from the Dowager Duchess's household years prior, he had left in a hurry. In his haste, or perhaps assuming he would eventually return to claim his betrothed, he had left several heavy pewter chests at Lambeth Palace containing his personal belongings. For years these chests had sat gathering dust, a silent testament to the illicit relationship that had occurred in the maiden's chamber. But with Derham now in the custody of the Privy Council, those chests transformed from forgotten luggage into a lethal threat. Agnes Tilney knew exactly how Tudor investigations operated. The king's commissioners would leave no stone unturned. They would undoubtedly dispatch armed guards to search her property. If the commissioners opened those chests, they might find letters, financial receipts regarding the £100, or even legal documents proving the existence of the pre-contract between Francis Derham and the current Queen of England. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized the elderly matriarch. She had spent her entire life meticulously building and protecting the Howard dynasty. Now the actions of a careless teenager and a swaggering pensioner threatened to bring the entire edifice crashing down. She had to act, in an act of profound desperation that would ultimately seal her fate. The Dowager Duchess summoned her most trusted servants. She ordered them to bring Derham's heavy trunks into her private chambers. Agnes Tilney did not call for a magistrate. She did not hand the chests over to the king's authorities. Instead, she ordered her servants to force open the locks. They pried the chests open and pulled out Derham's private papers. Standing directly before the stone fireplace in her private bedchamber, Agnes ordered the documents to be permanently destroyed in the flames. She watched as the physical evidence of Catherine Howard's past turned to ash and smoke. She likely believed that by destroying the paper trail, she was protecting her step-granddaughter, saving the Howard family from ruin, and insulating herself from the king's wrath. In reality, she was committing a catastrophic legal error. The true legal severity of Agnes Tilney's actions is best measured directly against the strict, entirely unforgiving nature of Tudor treason laws. Deceiving the king regarding the queen's virtue was considered high treason. But Agnes had not personally committed the treasonous act of the pre-contract. Her specific actions, knowing about the queen's legally compromising past, failing to report it to the king or the Privy Council, and then actively, deliberately destroying physical evidence to impede a royal investigation, met the exact legal criteria for a specific capital offense: misprision of treason. Misprision of treason meant the active concealment of a treasonous act. In the eyes of the Tudor state, covering up treason was just as dangerous and punishable by the exact same penalties as committing the treason itself. By burning those papers, Agnes Tilney transitioned from a negligent guardian into an active co-conspirator against the crown. The crown moved with terrifying efficiency. By December 1541, the king's commissioners, including the ruthless Thomas Wriothesley and William Fitzwilliam, the Earl of Southampton, arrived at the gates of Lambeth Palace. They were not there for a polite diplomatic visit. They were there to tear the household apart. The commissioners marched straight into the elderly duchess's bedchamber. They subjected Agnes Tilney, a woman who had served as a godmother to royal princesses and carried the train of queens, to a brutal, unyielding interrogation. Faced with the terrifying reality of the king's wrath and confronted with the testimonies extracted from her former wards and servants, the Dowager Duchess's defenses completely crumbled. The haughty matriarch broke down. She confessed to forcing open Derham's trunks. She admitted to burning the papers. She desperately tried to mitigate her guilt, weeping and claiming she only destroyed the documents out of a sudden, irrational panic, not out of any malice toward the king or a desire to commit treason. She claimed she was an old woman who had made a foolish mistake, but King Henry VIII was not in a forgiving mood. His reaction to the scandal was characterized by a terrifying, cold fury. He did not just want to punish his teenage wife. His pride had been shattered before the entire court, and he wanted to completely eradicate the network that had facilitated his public humiliation. He viewed the entire Howard family as a nest of vipers. The military arrived at Lambeth Palace to execute the king's orders. The scene was one of absolute humiliating devastation. Agnes Tilney was systematically stripped of everything that defined her power. Her massive household staff was dismissed. Her personal guards were removed. The keys to her estates were confiscated. The Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, an elderly woman in her mid-60s who had spent decades at the absolute pinnacle of English aristocratic society, was placed under formal arrest. She was escorted out of her magnificent home, placed on a heavily guarded barge, and transported down the freezing River Thames to the grim, imposing fortress of the Tower of London. She was locked in a damp stone cell, isolated from her family, her wealth, and her allies, forced to endure the freezing winter without the luxurious comforts she had commanded for decades. The woman who had believed she could manage the Tudor political machine through sheer force of will was now completely at the unforgiving mercy of the state. The king's vengeance did not stop with the Dowager Duchess. The purge of the Howard faction was relentless and sweeping. The Privy Council cast a wide net, arresting anyone who had been associated with Lambeth Palace or who might have known about Catherine's past. Lord William Howard, Agnes's son, and Catherine's uncle, and his wife were arrested and sent to the Tower. Agnes's daughters were interrogated. Numerous servants, musicians, and gentlewomen who had kept the secrets of the maiden's chamber were chained and imprisoned. The conservative Catholic faction, which had orchestrated the downfall of Thomas Cromwell just a year prior and had seemed invincible, was now facing total, unprecedented political destruction at the hands of the crown. Their enemies at court, particularly the reformist faction led by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, watched with quiet satisfaction as the mighty Howard dynasty collapsed in on itself. As the Howard family was being dragged in chains to the Tower, one man watched the impending destruction of his house and made a calculated, intensely ruthless move to save his own life. Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's uncle, and Agnes's stepson, was the most powerful conservative peer in the realm. He was the man who had actively placed Catherine in the king's path. But the Duke was the ultimate Tudor survivor. Seeing his faction collapsing and realizing his own head was in imminent danger, he did not rally to defend his niece or his stepmother. He did not appeal to the king for mercy. Instead, the Duke fled the court. he retreated to his heavily fortified country estate at Kinninghall in Norfolk. From the safety of his castle on December 14th, 1541, he wrote a cowardly, groveling letter directly to King Henry VIII. In the letter, the Duke of Norfolk denounced his family in the strongest, most violent terms possible. He called his stepmother Agnes and his niece Catherine abominable traitors. He stated that their crimes were so horrific that he would gladly watch them burn at the stake if it proved his own unwavering loyalty to the crown. He completely, unequivocally abandoned the Dowager Duchess. He threw his family to the wolves to save his titles and his life. Agnes Tilney was now entirely alone in the Tower of London, waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. The winter of 1541 descended upon the Tower of London with bone-chilling severity. Inside its damp, formidable stone walls, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, sat in absolute isolation. She was entirely cut off from the massive network of power she had spent a lifetime building. Her stepson, the Duke of Norfolk, had publicly abandoned her. Her son, Lord William Howard, was locked in a nearby cell. Her vast estates at Chesworth and Lambeth were occupied by the king's men. The matriarch who had carried the trains of queens and served as godmother to royal princesses was now simply a prisoner of the state, waiting in the freezing dark for the executioner's axe. But the Tudor state, led by a deeply humiliated King Henry VIII, was not satisfied with merely taking her life. They intended to entirely erase her legacy. In Tudor England, trying a high-ranking aristocrat for treason in an open court was always a politically sensitive, highly public affair. It gave the accused a platform to speak, and it required a jury of their peers to publicly condemn them. King Henry VIII and his Privy Council recognized that putting Agnes Tilney, the highest-ranking woman in the kingdom and a revered figure of the old conservative establishment, on public trial could be messy. Furthermore, Agnes's crime was misprision of treason, concealing treason and destroying evidence, which, while a capital offense, lacked the visceral, undeniable malice of a direct plot to murder the king. To bypass the legal hurdles of a public trial and guarantee her absolute destruction, the Crown utilized its most terrifying legislative weapon, the Act of Attainder. Introduced into Parliament in early 1542, the Bill of Attainder was a legislative death sentence. It allowed the state to declare a person guilty of treason by an act of Parliament, without the need for a trial, a defense attorney, or a jury. When the act was passed, Agnes Tilney was officially, legally convicted. The punishment was absolute and devastating. The primary purpose of an Act of Attainder was not just execution, it was financial annihilation. The law dictated that the condemned person's blood was corrupted, meaning they could no longer own property or pass it down to their heirs. The Crown seized everything. King Henry's commissioners systematically stripped the Dowager Duchess of her massive empire. Every manor house she owned, every acre of profitable agricultural land, and her immense annual income were confiscated. But the king's men dug deeper. They raided her private vaults and seized her personal fortune. Inventory records from the time reveal the staggering wealth Agnes possessed. The Crown confiscated mountains of finely crafted silver plates, heavy gold chains, priceless tapestries, and caskets filled with exquisite jewels. The financial independence that Agnes had fiercely protected since her widowhood in 1524 was entirely absorbed into the royal treasury. In a matter of days, the richest woman in England, was rendered completely destitute, while Agnes was being stripped of her wealth on paper. The physical reality of the king's vengeance played out on the execution scaffold. On February 13th, 1542, Queen Catherine Howard and Lady Jane Rochford were led out of their cells to the private execution scaffold erected on Tower Green. Catherine, the vivacious teenager who had been thrust onto the throne by her ambitious family, was pale and exhausted. The night before, terrified of the block, she had requested the executioner bring it to her cell so she could practice laying her head upon it to ensure she died with dignity. Catherine addressed the small selected crowd, confessing to a sinful life but maintaining her royal composure. With a single stroke of the axe, her young life was extinguished. Jane Rochford, the accomplice who had facilitated Catherine's fatal affair, followed her to the block moments later. The king's honor had been washed clean with blood. Now the king turned his attention back to the architect of the cover-up. In the immediate aftermath of Catherine's execution, King Henry VIII fully intended for Agnes Tilney to follow her step-granddaughter to the block. He believed that the woman who had burned the evidence of his humiliation deserved to die. However, practical Tudor politics and the cold logic of the Privy Council intervened. The king's initial white-hot rage was beginning to subside. His advisors gently pointed out the reality of the situation. Agnes Tilney was an old woman, approximately 65 years of age, which was considered quite elderly in the 16th century. She was frequently ill and suffering from the physical toll of her imprisonment in the damp tower. More importantly, the Privy Council pointed out that the Crown had already achieved its primary objective. They had successfully stripped her of every single piece of property and wealth she owned. Executing an elderly, destitute, and chronically ill woman would serve no further political purpose. It might even backfire, generating unwanted sympathy for the old conservative establishment. She was no longer a threat. She was a ghost. On May 5th, 1542, after nearly 6 months of terror and isolation in the Tower of London, the heavy wooden doors finally opened. Agnes Tilney was quietly released. Agnes had survived the king's wrath, but she stepped out of the tower into a world where she no longer truly existed. The woman who had emerged was not the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. She had been stripped of her titles, her massive estates, and her immense fortune. She had no retinue, no luxurious palaces, and no political influence. The conservative Howard faction was in ruins, desperately trying to distance itself from the scandal to survive. She spent the final 3 years of her life in complete, impoverished obscurity. The exact details of her final years are scarce, highlighting just how effectively the Tudor state had erased her from the public narrative. She likely relied on the quiet, secret charity of distant relatives or former allies who had survived the purge. In May 1545, at the age of 68, Agnes Tilney passed away. There was no grand state funeral. There were no heralds proclaiming her titles and no royal attendants. The woman who had once been the highest-ranking peeress in England was buried quietly at St. Mary's Church in Lambeth, the very parish where her catastrophic failure of leadership had taken place. The downfall of Agnes Tilney is a stark, brutal lesson in the absolute limits of aristocratic power under an autocratic monarch. For decades, Agnes believed that her high rank, Her immense wealth and her long history of service to the crown insulated her from consequence. She ran her household like an independent fiefdom, assuming that she could manage a massive legal crisis, the pre-contract of a future queen, through sheer force of will, physical intimidation, and a stone fireplace. In a system defined by the king's absolute supremacy, covering up the truth was not an act of family preservation, but a fatal miscalculation. Agnes Tilney gambled a dynasty on a lie, believing she could outsmart the paranoia of Henry VIII. Instead, her silent cover-up destroyed a queen, brought the mighty Howard family to its knees, and ensured her own remarkable life of power ended in total obscurity.